Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined, as always, by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg. As everyone knows well, at this point, we are in the throes of General Assembly season, and it only keeps getting better. Recently, we've walked through the week of the Assembly, day by day, trying to give a sense of the whole week, what you may expect in Richmond in June, and that overview was rather general. But now we're going to start getting more specific. It's time for, I didn't ask the guys if I could call it this, but the first annual Polity Matters Overtures Overview. It's just one big game is really all it is. It's lots of back and forth and challenging and arguing, and we're going to try to keep it fun and upbeat. But before that, we do want to introduce you to our guest today. We are happy and excited to have Alex Ford joining us. Alex, welcome. Introduce yourself to us and the listeners. Who are you? Where are you serving? Why do you have a weird interest in polity and General Assembly? And, how'd you wind up here?
Yeah, no, that's great. My name's Alex Ford. I'm the pastor of Brigham City Bible Church in northern Utah. You asked if how I got to have an interest in polity, and the short answer is because I'm a super nerd. And I like that we do things decently and in order. I like that there are rules, and if there are rules, we should pay attention to them. So, here I am.
Well, we're glad to have you. Thank you. For our big long game that we have today, I'm going to hand it over to my companion, Scott Edberg, and he's going to tell us exactly what's about to go down. And the truth is just because I don't really know, but he does. So here it is.
Well, Alex, we're glad to have you on. We know that you are the founder of the Babylon Bee, and so it's delightful to have you on and perhaps defend the bee at some point and some controversial statements. But full disclosure, as we go...
Not the bee. Right?
Not the bee. Oh, not the bee. Yeah, that's a not the bee take. As we go through, we're going to not go through the overtures in perhaps chronological order, but thematic order, and so we'll be jumping around. It's probably wise for a listener following along to go to the PCAGA website, click overtures, and probably just read through them as we read through them and work through them. We're not going to go through every overture either. That 35 overtures would probably kill all of us, and we're not trying to have overtures committee before overtures committee. And so we are probably going to group them together, and we will try to take the best ones that we believe, at least individually, are perhaps the better versions. And so the disclosure here for this episode, as we begin this fun game that my brother just talked about, Ben, is that we'll be representing overtures that we may or may not agree with. And so we are kind of going back and forth, where one of us will present the overture in its best light, in a positive light, while the other three will then criticize it, ask questions about it, and then poke holes into it. And so you might find yourself in a situation during this episode where Scott comes out in favor, it seems, of something that he might personally disagree with, or he might be criticizing something that he personally wants to see passed. And so while we outline these various overtures, just know that it is not necessarily the personal opinion of the person presenting and how they present it. We're trying to perhaps create a tool that helps you better think through some of the issues in the church. We'll not be going through all of the overtures that deal with various boundary changes. So Overture 5 and 12 with Catawba and Piedmont Triad, that's not controversial and doesn't take a lot of work, so it's unnecessary. Also with Overtures 8, 11, 34, and 35. Those are boundary changes and mergers, and they will not take much substance, especially since MNA has answered most of those. And so it'll be quick to go through that. So let's jump in.
I'm going to fight one of them, though. I'm going to fight the covenant presbytery boundary change. I'm going to stand up on the floor of General Assembly and speak against it. So
you're going to be that one guy.
You say it's not controversial, but they can't take from us. All right. That's all I'm saying.
They can't take from us. Mississippi Valley, the greatest Presbyterian PCA.
Hey,
let's begin then. We're going to start.
Right? Come on.
Oh, sorry. We're going to start in the rules of discipline. We have various sections, and maybe Ben will put all the main sections we have in the show notes, just so it's easier to follow along. Yeah. But we're going to start with witness eligibility. This is in the rules of discipline section of what we'll be considering at PCAGA this year. And we're going to look at Overture 1 and 18 really quick. And I have been assigned, it's me versus Ford, Nelson, and Ratliff, and we're going to outline that. But we're going to look at Overture 1 and 18. And what these overtures seek to do, just as a general overview, is they seek to broaden witness eligibility within our courts. They want to broaden it by either, if you take both of them in the idea, by either restricting who's competent to share as a witness in our church court and ecclesiastical trial, and or atheists and those who believe in God on who can actually serve in an ecclesiastical trial. I think personally 18 is a better version of this. It is that overture that perhaps cleans up Overture 1, in my opinion. And Overture 18 exists in light of Overture 1. If you go through the rationales of 18, you see that they created this overture to perhaps perfect and better apply Overture 1. And so when thinking through why we would need to broaden who can be an eligible witness in the church, you might want to do that in order to better protect the peace and the purity of the church. For example, under our current constraints and polity, there might be an atheist who has witnessed something that is terrible that a pastor has done or someone else. And currently, as our Constitution stands, they are not eligible to provide witness for that. Some have said that there are workarounds for allowing that, whether that's through affidavits, through the civil realm, or something of that nature, but it is clunky at best and unhelpful and harmful at worst. And so Overture 18 seeks to alleviate that issue by allowing those who deny not only the true and living God, but any God. They themselves now, if this overture is passed, would be able to testify. Overture 18 also reduces the competency of perhaps what we have seen in the past. In our current BCO 35, we see that competency is limited by age and mental faculties. Overture 18 also removes that from it all, saying all people are competent witnesses to be considered for testimony in a church. And so Overture 18 switches the conversation from competency perhaps then to credibility, allowing everyone to present as needed if they have witnessed something, but then the court itself judging it, that witness's credibility to actually share truth in the matter of what they are witnessing to. And so opening up, it's perhaps a deep dive then into who can actually be a witness. And so, guys, what do you think about Overture 1 and 18? What are some potential issues that you see in this overture?
Well, there's a couple. One is this had a lot of pushback last year about just the entire idea of eliminating oaths, the need for oaths in office if this is actually kind of at odds with our confessions, with Westminster Confession 22 that has it's needful to have oaths. So there's a lot of pushback that I think will come from that. I think the other is messing with competency in one of two ways has unintended consequences. On the first one, Overture 1 actually gives a lot of power to the court to determine who is competent. And actually, the result of that could be not a widening, but a narrowing, that more people could be declared not competent to stand trial. It's giving that power to the court. Eliminating it altogether makes me wonder with 18, who might be not considered competent, then if that's being eliminated as a category. There's no objective standard, of course, but does this mean that kids can testify? Does this mean that people with mental disabilities can, and it's just not a category anymore? I think there's unintended consequences that are going with those. So those are my two arguments I think we'll see there is messing with oaths and messing with competency.
Yeah, I think the argument about competency is probably answered pretty well by the evaluation that the court will then have to do of is this valuable, useful testimony, but it effectively says anyone can testify. I think the bigger issue, if we're pointing out issues, the bigger issue is we don't have any way, the reason that we have that requirement of, you have to be somebody who believes in a a state of reward and punishment after this life, is because that's the only reward and punishment there can possibly be. We have no force. We don't have a contempt of court. We can't imprison people. We don't have the sword. There's no threat associated with lying under oath in a church court, unless you believe in an eternal state of reward and punishment. And so that is the check on, somebody just coming in and saying whatever they want. I think that is going to be the bigger issue in terms of debate. Yeah.
What do you have to say to that, Scott?
What do I have to say to that, Scott? I think whenever you're just as a general, when we're in the ROD and thinking about revisions through it, a lot of the issues and difficulty that the assembly will reckon with is historically in the PCA, it's just been very hard to change long-standing statutes. And this is a long-standing statute, a very long-standing statute that is in many regards even older than our own denomination. And so whenever you're addressing changes like this, the assembly typically is pretty slow. The question of the assembly will have to grapple with, in light of what Alex just said, is whether or not how needed is atheist testimony? What would it change in the life of the church? What cases would be made that weren't made because of atheist or not having atheist testimony? And so I think that's the big question that the assembly will have to answer and address. There is a possibility that even if we do pass 18 in its totality, in some ways it doesn't change much. If the latter is true, where there is no real evidence of an atheist swaying testimony or not in an ecclesiastical trial. So perhaps we can overthink of it. Moving on to perhaps 4, because we have a lot to go through today. Overture 4 is from Central Indiana Presbytery. And it discusses, and it's going to probably be a preliminary from the rest of the ones that I seek to defend here. It is to establish a study committee for judicial rule changes. This year will probably be known. Last year it was about checks and balances. We were review and control GA. That's kind of how I thought of it. This year we're going to be a ROD GA, rules of discipline GA. And so Overture 4 seeks to establish a it seeks to establish a study committee for judicial rules, where it seeks to postpone all of the things that perhaps even the last thing we talked about and everything else between chapters 27 and 46 of our BCO, and defer them to a study committee for review and recommendation for the 52nd General Assembly. Well, why this could be seen as a good idea is that, as you will see as we go through some of these overtures, the Overtures Committee will not be able to handle all of this. There's an overture coming up in just a few minutes that's 37 pages. And I don't think that the OC will be able to adequately handle 37 pages of content going through chapter by chapter of the ROD. And so it might be more prudent to assign in a committee to study the issue, and then at the next General Assembly make recommendations to overhaul. Why this is also a good idea, perhaps in that same vein, is the understanding that our current rules of discipline are Frankenstein together and often broken and mildly contradictory. And so because of the piecemeal nature of our rules of discipline, a study committee in this context would offer us a clean slate where we can fix the rules of discipline. Nobody doubts that there are broken provisions in the rules of discipline. 31.2 over the last 5 years gives you perhaps an example of that. There are broken parts. And so why not take the opportunity this year to establish a committee to try to seek a holistic overhaul that unifies our rules of discipline and makes them more effective before the broader church. Overture 4 also includes names of some of the most qualified men within the denomination that have served on the PCAs, SJC, and other connections as it relates to judicial process and rule and polity. And so this overture also provides a list of names for who would serve on that committee. And so it's an overhauling committee that seeks to revitalize our rules of discipline. Do you guys see any perhaps potential harms in this overture?
I just think the group of men is too small. I'm not opposed to, like the principle here, but and by the way, we're playing the part, right? Scott keeps sort of saying that the positive argument would be, I'm just going to assume the negative argument. I don't know if this is where I'm at, but let's put more people on it. Make it look. Our PR handles a lot of documents in one go. They read a lot and they've figured out how to disseminate things and have them come back to the overall committee. So I can understand 11 men may be enough to go through something and sift through it and it not get too cumbersome. But I think we've illustrated with RPR, and maybe even we could think about NOMCOM. It's not quite as much heavy lifting, but we know how to handle big documents as a larger group, even from a distance sometimes. I would add more men to this. If folks are going to be concerned that Overtures has a good representation, and so we should keep giving all this stuff to them, well, let's put more representation on a committee like this. Doesn't necessarily have to be 88 or 89 men, but it could be more than 11. That's just the first place my mind goes if I think about negative sides.
One of the complaints that I've seen about this is that it shuts Overtures Committee out of the process.
Yeah.
And I think your suggestion of more people would be a way around that if that were a legitimate concern. As Scott said, there's a lot to this, and there's a lot going on here. I think the intention, if I've understood it right, was to have these men work on the whole slate of things touching on the rules of discipline, and then submit a slate of changes to Overtures next year. So it would not cut Overtures out so much as just have a team that can put it all together in a way that is coherent, that fits together, that has different viewpoints there. So I'm probably breaking Scott's rule here, where I'm supposed to be, pointing holes in it. But
finally, if somebody's broken it a little bit, that makes me feel a whole lot more relaxed going forward. So thank you for doing that. It's like spilling coffee on your couch for the first time. Yeah, it's great.
Well, I think there are some problems that I don't think this is going to make it out of Overtures Committee, and I'll tell you, I'll be the negative guy. Number one, why these members? I think if Overtures Committee starts down this road, then they're going to be saying, well, why this person? Let's replace them with this other person. And I think you're going to get bogged down in that. CCB has pointed out the financial has not been taken up on this. Who pays for the fact that this committee has to do all this work? And Overtures Committee is capable. There are men that are reading these overtures that have suggestions for changes. They prepared to do the work, and I think they're able to do it. Something like this could form on its own. These guys that are listed there, they could get together or have a Zoom call and work through some of these things and then propose it in their presbytery. I don't think it's a need for the Overtures Committee to commit that to them. They could do this on their own and perfect some of these things. And I think some of these overtures, if they're voted down this year, may have people that are working on them and groups that are working on them. So it just doesn't seem. My negative on it is I don't think it'll make it out of OC. I think the OC is able to do it, and if they try to do this, they're going to get bogged down in details, especially the people who are doing it.
At the very least, this list is helpful
this
for us because I noticed nearly half of the men on this list have been on this podcast as guests. So this just gives us more people to reach out to, more nerds to have on. Sorry, that's trivial. Come on, Scott.
Yeah, I was thinking the positive nature for this for the OC is it would knock our 35 overtures down to like 15. I mean, most of them would all be referred. I mean, you could refer most of what we're talking about today to that committee, and so we could all get lattes and drinks and not have to work both Monday and Tuesday. We can just.
So you're saying, like in theory, if this passed, that a bunch of the other overtures, even from this year, could get referred to this committee immediately.
Yeah,
that's the intention.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
That all of this year's rules of discipline change overtures would be referred immediately to this committee.
Yeah.
And the Overtures Committee deals with, things like background checks in the form of government, and not have to fool with the rules of discipline, because anything you touch in rules of discipline, you pull one thread and 17 others start coming loose. And so you got to kind of keep it all together together.
Well, and it wouldn't make sense, right? If you made this committee, why would you keep Overture 1 and 18 out of it if that committee then might address the exact issue that you're talking about next year? And so it's like, and so you'd be amending the Constitution just to have it overhauled anyway.
Right.
And so you might as well throw everything at it, which would be around like 15 to 17 of our 35 overtures. And then you take out the boundary change overtures, and there's another 6. So you're down to like 10 to 15 overtures of
All I'm
actual
hearing is that
substance.
Scott is lazy, and so that would be a good
Yep.
reason.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So
I'm just excited about the
CCB,
adult beverages.
CCB says it's in conflict with RAO, but that's actually acknowledged in the overture itself, right?
Yeah, I think the one part that isn't, they touched on the financial side of it.
Right. Okay.
CCB did. And I think,
yeah.
I mean, if we want to push this, I think we could just say it needs to be amended to include the financial side in the suspension of rules.
Mm-hmm.
We're already talking about suspending the rules to have 11 guys on here instead of 7. We just tag that financial thing into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I missed that. That's yeah.
Building upon that motif is Overture 20. This is also from Central Indiana, but I believe it was rejected by Central Indiana and sent up by a ruling elder Dan Barber's church.
Is this the one
there
you want me to
from-
read all the way through right now? You want me to just
yeah,
start at the
we
beginning?
could do a
Like
Presby
VCO
reading
style?
hour for those who have insomnia. This one has proposed systematic changes to BCO 31, 32, and 35. It outlines perhaps, I mean, this is probably one of the most substantial overtures I've ever read and relates to what it overhauls. I mean, it touches every single part of 31, 32, and 35. And again, that's back to that same idea that we were just talking about with Overture 19, where there's Overture 4, sorry. Overture 4, where there's a bunch of broken parts that need to be fixed. And so this overture works in tandem with the Overture 4 that we just discussed, where here are a list of idea changes that should be made to our Constitution. Again, the same author for Overture 4 is the author of this. I'm sure he's thinking in his mind, and I would agree with him in that sense, is that we should refer this then to that committee. This long 37-page overture. I know that our brother Nelson is optimistic that the OC could handle this, but I'm also seeing the OC word salad much minor overtures, let alone an overture with such substance as this. I know that CCB says it's in grave conflict with the Constitution, if you've seen that report yet, but of course it's going to be. It's overhauling 3 chapters of the Constitution in its totality. Of course, there's going to be constitutional questions about that. And that's part of the overhaul process as we relate it to sending it to the committee. So when thinking about this overture, it is a systematic overhaul. I don't want to read it. It would take forever to read, but it goes basically section by section, making changes, sometimes minor, sometimes very substantial changes to our book of discipline.
I think the argument against it is basically the CCB report, and that not only is it substantial in those sections, but basically it would also need to have some sort of a change with BCO 13.1 and 2 and 43 and 31.4 and 35.4 and 13.1 and 32.7, and the potentiality of it conflicting with actually scripture in 1 Timothy 5:19 on only allowing one witness for something. So I think it has too many things it's trying to do. I think the argument against that is it's too big of a lift. There's too many red flags of unintended consequences. So that's my argument against it. I think it's doomed.
And
Well, that's how you really feel, Jared.
If I've understood right, I think this was the first move in kind of thinking through these steps. Was okay. We've just finished this recent trial that happened. What have we learned? What didn't work? What did we do according to the polity that seems not to have resulted in, what we might hope would have resulted? All right. How do we need to fix what is broken? This is too much to do all at once. We need to, and then, out of that idea came the idea for a committee to work through these things in a systemic way. I think Scott's right that these 2 overtures are tied together in essential ways. almost. And I think that obviously there are serious questions about what's going on in all of these different ways that it fits together. But I think that was an acknowledgement even in putting it together, was this does still need some perfection. It does still need some work, and it needs to be done over a longer time than can be accomplished in 2 days of, even if 2 very long days of overtures wouldn't have time to work through all of these things. And probably a lot of the men on overtures, smart, well-meaning men, don't have the experience of having worked through a trial the way that some of the men suggested in Overture 4 probably do. So.
Yeah, this is one of those overtures that perhaps a liability is that there's so much going on. There's something for everyone to be against. And because of that, what I've learned in my short time in the PCA is more words, more problems. And the more you say, the more it's scrutinized and the more difficult it will be to pass. And so, I mean, think of Overture 8 a few years ago with trying to fix 31.2. There were many people that failed it just because of the issue with sessions to presbyteries, right? Where the threshold would be so low that it would make original jurisdiction too easy for presbyteries to do that with sessions. And so maybe the SJC side of things was great with the presbytery to SJC, but the liability was adding also the session to presbytery relation. And it may have passed, quite honestly, if it didn't include that, because that was a major liability to it. And so overtures like this also have that kind of problem. Overture 21 is, again, from the same group, guys from Central Indiana Presbytery that failed there, I believe, as well. Did this one fail? Or did this one get some? This one passed, sorry. I gotta have better notes on this stuff. This one is the change in prohibition against interlocutor appeals. I'm not going to use interlocutor.
Try again.
No, I don't want to say that. No, I'm not doing it. And this is dealing with complaints in the midst of judicial process. And so this is, again, dealing with the trial that was pervasive and known throughout the PCA in Central Indiana. And one of the issues that they found themselves in is that during the whole process, there were constant like stop here before you go further kind of things, where there were complaints lodged up concerning previous decisions that stopped them from engaging in process. And so the idea that this seeks to fix is that it would delay perhaps frivolous complaints or even substantial complaints until after the judicial process is complete. And so it's a delay in order to actually finish it. This is perhaps important in the idea that Presbyterian church government is already very slow, and going through things like this with judicial process, courts, and things of that nature already take 2 to 3 years. And when you have complaints then tied into it, it extends it from 3 years to like 4 to 5 years. And so the scope of the issue just remains much longer needlessly, perhaps. And so Overture 21 then is seeking to address that by saying you can still lodge a complaint against the action of presbytery, but we're going to put it to the side for a time while we finish the judicial process that's set forth here. And so I think it perhaps in that light is a helpful overture in guiding our processes, less gumming up of the system.
So I think the potential pitfall there is the reason we allow complaints during the middle of things now is because things get done wrong now in the middle of things. And if they're done wrong, we need to fix them now before we move on to the next thing, which might then be building a house of cards on top of sand that's going to just get knocked down when the complaint comes through. So if we don't deal with the complaint now, the whole rest of the process may get invalidated later. So as much as we might want to be able to streamline things, and I absolutely am, sympathetic to that desire, we've got a process that we do for a reason to make sure that every step along the way gets done as it should be, and not have to go back and redo the entire trial and maybe have poison the well on witnesses and testimony and things like that.
CCB points out there's a conflict with 43.2 in terms of timelines of doing complaints, and that's something that would have to be fixed. Although taking off my opposition hat and putting on a different hat, that is fixable. And it was interesting reading this, that this change actually comes from a suggestion in the SJC opinion that says these may be things that need to be changed in the future. So there is something that's good here. And if it gets fixed, I think it's something that really needs to be considered by Overtures Committee.
Jared's not playing by the rules,
actually,
Scott. I don't appreciate that.
1 point deducted.
I'm going to take off my hat too. I agree with this overture. I think it's a good idea. Yeah, there's some fixes that need to be made. But Scott was forcing me to, be mad about it, and so I was trying.
Listeners, for the record, none of us
tried.
are wearing hats. I don't know what these guys are talking about. This is very weird. Very weird.
Ben, what do you think? You're not saying anything during this episode.
Yeah, well, because, like a General Assembly meeting, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it. But I'm not going to be the guy that's going to jump in and just repeat everything. I don't have to have it come out of my mouth.
You sure it's that and not just that you haven't read these overtures?
Yeah, no, pretty sure. Yeah. I'm a consummate professional. I host a Polity Matters podcast, and I read everything that we're supposed to study and talk about, and yep, always caught up.
In Overture 25, moving on here, we get into two overtures from TVP, Tennessee Valley, Overture 25 and 26. They are different and substantially so in many regards, but they deal with similar content matter. Overture 25 as amend the BCO 31 to expand on who may assist in investigations. And so this overture seeks to do something simple. It is to clarify who may help in the investigation of someone in the higher court. And so there have been differing opinions on whether the BCO requires sessions and presbyteries alone to conduct a 31-2 investigation. And this amendment is intended to clarify that a session or presbytery has the option to use outside resources in addition to the session and presbytery. And so this would be trying to solidify the idea of using ministries like Grace, where they come in and they do an independent investigation in order to help a presbytery out as it investigates a matter. Other examples would be in the overture as it's written is a presbytery using forensic accountant to review evidence and prepare a report on allegations concerning a minister in a reimbursement scheme against the church with Amazon and things of that nature. So it is seeking to solidify the idea that we could use outside sources in our investigatory work as a presbytery. And so that is the main purpose of it.
Since I was recently accused of not reading anything by our guest of all people.
Sorry.
Do not apologize. Do not. Is there, I'll just ask a question. I'm genuinely interested, Scott, since you wrote this, or at least pretending like you wrote it. Is there anything that prevents a session from doing something like this anyway?
Currently, no. I think I don't think there's any issue with using Grace that is currently done across the PCA. There were a few reports discussed in recent history that Grace has conducted. No, I think what this does is it clarifies and makes known that there is a lifeline out there for other presbyteries and churches to use that may not be aware that they can use things like this, whether it be Grace or a forensic expert in validating something for the help of the presbytery. And so I think what it's seeking to do is to make known that there are resources and tools that can by presbyteries and trying to make those tools better known in our Constitution.
I think the biggest argument against this is that it's not necessary because sessions and presbyteries can do this already. That said, switching hats, I think it's a great idea because there has been this argument, not so much with forensic accountants. Nobody really is arguing about, do we need to bring in an accountant or a CPA or something to trace money problems? But in abuse situations, or at least accused abuse situations, is there a need to bring in an outside expert in that type of situation to give this session more information? And there's been some argument that that's inappropriate, that the session or the presbytery or whoever the elders should be in their role as elder competent to evaluate such things. I think this would give some clarity that those two things, though they're very different cases, fall under the same category of getting some help from somebody who knows what they're talking about to help us as we decide. We're still making the decision as the elders, but it's totally appropriate to call in, get some information from other people.
I'll keep my hat on as somebody pointing out liabilities.
I'm so confused.
Just to say, there's some potential problems with having an outside group come in. One, they may not know quality, so they may not know exactly how they're supposed to conduct interviews. It may not be right in terms of how oaths are administered and things like that. So an outside group could come in and not know that they are doing things not according to our polity that may actually help somebody get off that is accused. And I think another problem of this could be they may have different goals and standards that they're under. And when they produce a report, knowing if you're going to be able to control what's made known from that report, somebody may have been accused of something and they said, there's no evidence of this, but now everybody knows that they're accused. And especially if it goes outside of the church, there could be some bad things that come from that. So a church can already do this. To encourage them to do that, maybe encouraging them to do something that they're not prepared to let the outside group know exactly what they want them to do, exactly how our polity works, and exactly what they want released to the public. So if you can already do this, why put this in there and encourage church to do something that they may not be competent to actually instruct the group to do?
Scott, we have all spoken on this one, so I think that means you're allowed to move along.
Moving on to Overture 26. I'm running out of overtures here to address, and I've still got 1,000 more. Amend BCO 3219 to expand representation of the accused before the church courts. And so this is also from Tennessee Valley. They're actually two different authors for 25 and 26. 26 seeks to allow better representation to people in the lower court that may not have good representation within their own church. And so there's an issue of, say, you're in like a church plant and there's not many resources within that church plant, but you have an issue with the session and you need representation, but you can only use people from the current pool of your church as representation. And therefore you might not be represented well. And so the current rules limit the representation of who can represent who in the local congregation, which may be a small group of people that aren't well versed in our polity. And so because our rules of discipline elsewhere allow for broader representation that already exist when you think of the presbytery level and then the General Assembly level, the argument here in this overture is to allow anyone who is a member in good standing in the PCA then to help you as your representative before the church court. And so this is to help those who are marginalized and don't have all the knowledge concerning our complicated polity, as you probably are already witnessing in this episode. And therefore, it might be helpful to expand that by allowing the professionals or some people well-versed to help represent you, given that you may not know how well to represent yourself.
I think you just touched on the biggest liability for this overture, is the idea of professionals, that there will be a class of canon lawyers who will be gadding about the PCA. And so you get somebody who's accused of something, and they then call in the top representative from the PCA, from somewhere else in the country. Well, now you've got the session who is trying to adjudicate this case and is getting absolutely, the prosecutor's getting blown out of the water by the professional representative. I think that's the greatest risk here.
Yeah, I think Ford's argument's good, but also the clerk of session or even somebody in the presbytery should be able to provide some help as well in terms of what their process and what they should walk through should be. So if we're just arguing against it, that there should be resources that's provided by the clerk and other people around that isn't just coming in to represent them as if they have their professional lawyer there with them. That said, accused people often don't know their rights. They don't know what they are able to do. The process. I knew somebody who was a deacon, went through process and didn't realize he could appeal, and was never told to him. And so
I'm sure
a lot of people that should know. Yeah, there's a lot of people that should know that don't, and so there is a need for people to have some help. So I guess
I think
that's
there's
the
a way to limit the risk that I was talking about. And there's been some discussion about this online, but I think the best version that I saw was to say, yeah, any member in good standing in the PCA can be a representative, but no representative can handle more than one case concurrently. So if you've got, 7 canon lawyers throughout the PCA, each of them can only be representing one case until that case is finished, and then they can take a different case after that. And that limits that, you got, I don't know, whoever.
But how could they build a career off of it if you do something like that? I mean,
I'm just gonna not touch that.
Yeah, I was. Oh, come on. You guys are making good points. There is help out there, right? For congregants that need help in the courts. We don't always know where they are or what's going on. Sometimes, if they're not on Twitter and we're, paying attention to Presbyterian stuff, they might not know that there's help available if they're just, a member of a small church somewhere who's, in a situation they can't handle because their elders are not assisting them in the proper ways. Yeah.
And I think that's the issue in my mind with this is ideally the clerk of session or the moderator would help someone file a complaint against them. But I don't think that's really the practice. I think a lot of people are on their own and they do so poorly, which does again mess up the whole system because they don't know their rights. They skirt their rights by doing things they're not supposed to do because they don't know they're not supposed to do them. And the session isn't throwing them any lifelines because why would they want to help them? In the human sense, lodge a complaint, appeal, or something against them. And so churches don't do that. And so they do and should. They should help because that's affording them the rights they have. But I don't know if that's actually the case with most churches.
It's one of the whole points of our system is to help the people, right? I mean, we're trying to preserve the church.
But let's be honest, that a lot of what Scott's describing, that sessions especially don't give that help. A lot of sessions don't know these things. Yeah. They don't know what the right way to do it is. They don't know what is supposed to be expected of them. And obviously this overture is not going to fix that. But it at least provides some outlet, some additional aid, from an outside source or at least outside the local session, whatever. There could be some advantage to this.
Last overture assigned to me is amend BCO 41 to allow venue change for judicial cases. This is as simple as it sounds. 19.
Thank you.
Overture 19 in the OCs.
I don't have them memorized like you do, so it's just hard for me to,
Yeah, you got to become a robot. You got to dream about these overtures, and then
we proved in the last episode that you're not a robot. So it's okay.
The what's 19 seeks to address is quite simply to have a lateral change in who's overseeing a case of process to better ensure perhaps impartiality. Say you have a small presbytery and there's not a lot of resources. There might be a lack of impartiality in a trial. And so you might want to seek help from a lateral jurisdiction or a presbytery. And so you might enlist the help of, I'm in Ileana, we're a really small presbytery, and perhaps a judicial trial encompasses too much of us. And so this overture would allow us then to petition and reference Missouri Presbytery right next to us and ask for aid and help, since they have much larger resources and a greater ability to perhaps, in a better objective sense, to adjudicate a matter for us. So it seeks to help those in courts where they might not be well trained. We were just talking about the training of ruling elders and session members and teaching elders to this. not being the best. And so this seeks to broaden that pool again with ecclesiastical process by allowing us to go from one jurisdiction to another in a lateral way. And so typically in Presbyterian policy, the move is hierarchical. You go from the session to the presbytery to the General Assembly. This would allow a lateral move to go to an equal presbyterial jurisdiction to help you with the matter of process.
Yeah, CCB points out this is in conflict, so this would at least need to be fixed with 31 or 39.1. So there's a lot more, some more work that would need to be done to make this constitutional. Another pushback on this would be, isn't this an argument for something like synods? Maybe there's another level that's needed that can be a reference so that you're not running out of levels of appeal. If you're at the presbytery level and feel you need to reference it somewhere else, that it's not just straight to the SJC. So I guess the pushback would be there's problems with it that are in conflict with other parts of the Constitution, and perhaps there's other ways to address this.
And one of the things I say is it's in conflict with a preliminary principle. That's a pretty strong statement, if they're correct.
Yeah, what we learned in Polity Matters is it's kind of hard to be against a preliminary principle because they're so broad.
Unless you're an assistant pastor, and then it's easy.
No comment. You're playing devil's advocate. That's what
no
you're doing.
comment. We've made 1,000 comments on that point. There's plenty of comments for that.
We are nice milquetoast Presbyterians.
Uh-huh.
Well, and this was also rejected by a presbytery. It's really hard to get Overtures Committee to consider that. So,
yeah.
That said, it is an interesting idea. I'm interested to play with it in my mind.
So, I'm in favor of the idea, at least.
Yeah.
Based on recent experience in my own presbytery, we had an issue that eventually went to trial, but it took a while to get there. It took a couple of investigation committees. So by the time it went to time to go to trial, time to form a judicial commission to hear the trial, finding men who hadn't already touched the case was a challenge. And we're not a small presbytery. We've got 30 some churches in the presbytery. But finding men who hadn't already been involved in this case in some way on one of the investigations or as directly connected to it was a challenge. And it would have been really nice to be able to say, hey, Rocky Mountain right next door to us, or Pacific just south of us, or Pacific Northwest north of us. Hey, can y'all sit as the judges on this? We'll provide the prosecutor and the defense counsel, but can you sit as judges on this since none of you are involved with it at all and you don't know any of the people? That would have been a really helpful thing in that moment.
That's an interesting argument, perhaps, for a layer that is only judicial. That's like synod, like a regional. You can have some judicial appointments from each presbytery, and then they will handle things if there's this thing that comes up. So it's an interesting idea.
So you are calling the idea in favor of judicial synods. They're like the council that you go to whenever there's a judicial, they're only
like a Fellowship of the Ring, or
yeah, like they're only activated in certain circumstances.
And
I don't know. I'm interested to play with the idea.
It's worth pointing out that some of our NAPARC sister churches have something very similar to this, where if there's a judicial case in the presbytery, it automatically goes to a neighboring presbytery or a collection of neighboring presbyteries, similar to the idea of a judicial-only synod, in group of presbyteries that gather just for judicial cases to hear from one of the members there. So this is not an unheard of thing in the Presbyterian and Reformed world.
Mm-hmm. Scott, are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
I thought you had 28.
Sorry.
You got one more.
Do I really? Oh, yeah. Sorry. I already threw out all my notes. I was so done with this episode. 28 is really simple. Sorry. Is to amend RAO 16-6C1. That's how convoluted we can get sometimes, to eliminate a conflict with BCO 40-5. This overture is actually really simple. It is one minor change. It replaces the word with from important to substantive. And the general idea is that during last year's BCO 40-5 citations of a few presbyteries, someone noted that there was an incongruency between BCO 40-5 and RAO 16-6. And so in order to bring about a better unity of language and application, this overture seeks to unify the language together. And so it's a really minor, it's probably as short as an overture can get as it relates to what changes, but maybe it's somewhat substantial in the author's mind for what it does change.
I mean, let's consider it though. I mean, one of these must be, I don't know, more important or forgive me, substantive than the other. I mean, we you have to determine which one carries more weight. Sorry, I'm trying to play around.
I think the biggest issue is, what does it mean? What's the difference between important and substantive?
Yeah.
Okay, these are not really different words. I mean, okay, so we call them different things, but what does that mean? There's no direction for when is something substantive but not important, or important but not substantive, and which process comes in play at any given time. And there's no direction given. Okay, sure, I'm all in favor of clarity and making sure that we don't have conflicts. Two different people or committees trying to work on the thing at the same time. But this doesn't really fix the underlying issue. It just changes one word.
That reminds me of some conversations I've had with my wife about, like, have you ever seen like the four sections? Like, it's important and urgent. It's urgent but not important. It's important but not urgent, and it's neither. And my wife asked me the other day, she's like, okay, I kind of get it, but if something's urgent, doesn't that make it kind of important if it's urgent? And so we're sitting there trying to think through examples of what's urgent but not important. And like, feeding the cat or something might be urgent, but not the most important act unless the cat's starving to death, I guess. But, and so that's what this kind of reminds me of, where you're like, okay, where are the spheres here? How do they overlap? Are they the same?
Well, does that concludes your list of overtures, right? Are you just going to leave now? Or, I mean, is that how it works?
Yeah, like
Once you finish
do.
your section, you leave, so that at the end, it's just going to be me, just alone. Is that how
Talking
we're
to
doing
yourself.
this? Yeah, just is that part of the game?
Well, we've been taking off our hats and putting on other hats a lot, so you can just debate yourself.
Debate myself. Well, does that mean it's Alex's turn?
Yes.
All right. So the first set of overtures, because y'all chose to assign me the easy ones, are the.
I almost feel bad
overtures.
for you, man. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Scott did all the
appreciate it.
assignments.
I'm glad to be able to shape this. So we're talking about background checks first. There's 5 overtures here. Overtures 6, 16, 17, 23, and 24. Fundamentally, in that list, there are 3 different approaches to making background checks some version of mandatory. 6 and 23 both specify particular checks from particular agencies or types of check, whether it's a fingerprint check or a particular FBI check. 16, 17, and 24 intentionally leave it up to the presbyteries. Just say you have to get a check, a background check. It doesn't say this particular type of check or whatever. Given that, and given the permission that I was given before we started to pick the one that I think is best and start there, I'm going to say let's start with 17. And I want to argue in favor of 17, but first let me touch on the 2 that are different, that are unlike these. 6 and 23 require things that, at least for my presbytery, would be, and I'm not exaggerating, would be illegal. In both cases, they require the sharing of the data, not just within the presbytery, not just to the local church from the presbytery, but also to the dismissing presbytery in the case of a transfer. At least in the state of California, all of that is illegal. There are very strict rules, very strict laws in California about what you can share and with whom. Obviously not designed with presbyteries and churches in mind, but with corporate America and hiring practices there. Which I suppose they make sense in terms of protection of privacy, but for our sake, our presbytery would not be able to, if 6 or 23 was passed, our presbytery would not be able to comply with the constitutional requirements of these overtures without violating state law, which seems like a pretty big problem to me. If we can avoid putting us in that situation, I'd very much appreciate it. That said, when we turn to the other three, 16, 17, and 24, substantively, the overtures they're functionally the same. The difference is in the therefore clause of each of them, the language of where these amendments get put is slightly different for some reasons that aren't important right now. But basically, they're just slightly different in terms of where it gets put. 17 says for the section 13.6, put it as a paragraph at the end of the current section, which allows, as we'll talk about, the other overtures that are going to be touching on section 13.6, that allows congruence with those without having to amend one or the other to adjust where it fits together. So that's why 17 is the best choice. I think without question, there is an argument for getting as much information as we can as we consider the personal character, the history of men coming for ordination, whether for teaching elder, ruling elder, deacon, doesn't matter. The men who are leading the church, we need to, and in our evaluation of those men, we need as much information as we can get as we evaluate. The decision still belongs to the presbytery of the session. This is just giving us additional information. I think one of the arguments in favor of the group of three versus 6 and 23, additionally, and CCB points this out, that for those, because they refer to particular checks, if the government were to say, we're not going to issue those checks to any religious organization, that effectively scotches any candidate from being passed and only allows the government a say in that. Whereas if we just say get a check of some kind, it gives a much broader latitude for the presbytery or the session to meet the constitutional requirement without submitting to the government, just by pillaging the government's information, stealing from Egypt, as it were.
Thinking of my own presbytery in this context and thinking of background checks, we are a very small presbytery, 13 churches, and every one of those churches is under 150 and under in attendance. We have very little monetary reserves, and the financials can be difficult. And so I would not be surprised that if any of these overtures pass the assembly, that my presbytery would likely vote them down because of the nature of expense that's included, that somebody has to pay for it. And you could say, well, Scott, just have the church pay for it. Well, churches aren't doing well. We don't have a lot of money at our churches. And because we have no money in our churches, we also have no money in our presbytery. And so there's a massive financial burden thinking through the training of officers and bringing them in. Though I know it's not expensive, but I think the demand of having it would scare my presbytery out of supporting it.
I think a pushback to this could also be, first off, are there presbyteries where this already happens, but now this is being very specific in how it has to happen? In Pennsylvania, according to state law, if you work with children, you have to have a background check. And so each church, when they're doing hiring, would require this either for the candidate to provide one or for the church to do it. And at that point, I do wonder about some of the wording of shall order, or if it could be more passive. That may be a problem there of, does the presbytery then have to run another background check because it's been 3 months or 6 months? So that could be a pushback of that. Also in having it as a shall versus a strongly recommended, or if it's possible, think of somebody that's coming from a country that doesn't have the availability of a background check. You can have missionaries that are being ordained within your presbytery, or thinking about a state that doesn't want to share that information. Now, some of this could be through a private or something like that. Keeping it somewhat generic maybe would be a help there. But just in thinking of what some of the pushback could be, I think you'd have some pushback of, are we doing multiple background checks, and exactly what's happening with them.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that a lot of presbyteries, I think, are already doing this, either because, like Pennsylvania, there's a requirement for anybody who works with children, or just some presbyteries who are proactive about it and saying, we're going to do this already. I think that's one of the advantages of the group of three over the other ones, because it gives the presbytery or the session the ability to say, we choose this check, or, shall cause to be run rather than shall run. Might be better language, so that it's not necessarily the presbytery has to order it, but the presbytery can require the candidate to order one and submit the data, whatever, that's, so if you've had one from the state 3 months ago, 6 months ago, submit that data and go from there. So that might be a possible way to amend it, to make it a little better. But I think this is a worthwhile thing to be pursuing.
Yeah, it's part of the awkwardness of this format is I think there's a lot of good things here. Devil is just in the details. And so most of my arguments against it are detail oriented. And
I think that's what we ran into last year when these overtures first started coming up, is there were a lot of guys who said, look, this is a great idea and we should be doing this. But the way that this overture is structured, like with 6 and 23, if you do this, you're going to put me the wrong side of California law. Please don't do that.
Yeah.
I think, as you say, the devil's in the details. All right.
Overture 2.
Ben, did you want to say anything about that before we move on?
I'm happy.
All right.
I think y'all said it. Yeah.
In that case, we'll move on to the best overture in the entire slate this year. And I'm only saying that because I wrote it. Overture 2 from Northern California Presbytery. There is some unclarity in the current version of BCO 13.6 as far as what is required of which type of transfer. There's an awful lot of options thrown into a very short space there in 13.6. So Overture 2 seeks to clarify what's required. The original version was not, the original intention, and I can say this because I wrote it, was not to change anything massively, but simply to clarify what we're already doing. Now, I realized after we got all the way through and submitted it that there are a couple of changes there, that there are some presbyteries that do not currently require men transferring between PCA presbyteries to state differences again. Most seem to. It seems to be a fairly common practice, but it's not a requirement currently, and the new language would require that. I think that's wise. I think it's a good idea. But that would be a change. It would also require the presbytery, and this was an intentional change. If you deny a transfer, then you have to state in the record on your minutes why, and you also have to communicate that information to the dismissing presbytery, so that there's clear communication. And there have been some examples in the not terribly distant past of men who were denied transfer and their dismissing presbytery was never told. Like the dismissing presbytery never even knew that he had been denied, never mind the reasons. So there's some cracks here that men are falling through, and it would be nice to shore those up.
I think the main pushback to this would just be if there's presbyteries that don't do this, maybe they don't want the extra work to do it. I think that's the main argument that I've seen is we don't do this and I don't want to have to do something else there.
Well, I think there's also an argument on that some might take issue with the idea of another court judging a man's scruples with our confession differently. And so a PCA court has already decided that these were acceptable as it relates to a man holding these views that differ. But now another court has to judge them again. And so in that judgment, what if they say, no, these strike at the vitals? And if they do strike at the vitals, then how is that man ever ordained in the first place? And what do you now do with that ordination? Do you bring him to trial? And so I think some might take that as an issue where they've already been rubber stamped as a mission as a pastor in the PCA, and now they may not be, but they're not allowed in certain places, perhaps because of their views.
I have heard that argument. I think there's no way around the preliminary principles that allow each court to set the terms of its own admission. And so if Presbytery A has a different set of standards, say just as one example on the days of creation and which positions you're allowed to hold to be in that presbytery, and Presbytery B is looser and allows any of the four positions, both of those are valid choices within our current rules. and this just gives, a codification of that, as it were, because that's currently what is practiced. If you are ordained in one presbytery, what they judge to be merely semantic, another may judge to be more than semantic, but not out of accord, and that's the prerogative of the presbytery to do that.
Yeah, the presbyteries have the authority to ordain and hold credentials for ministers. If the General Assembly was responsible for ordaining men, moving between presbyteries and maintaining your views that you were, stated at the beginning, your exceptions that were granted from the start, you just keep them your whole life. But because the presbytery is where the ordination happens, they have the right to turn a man away. I'm curious, do you guys know of a lot of men whose transfers are not permitted by the receiving presbytery and they're sent back?
Not a lot, but more than zero.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I don't know if I've ever heard of
that.
it actually happening before.
It's not always theologically based in one sense. Sometimes the church has gone through something,
Yeah.
and you might not want to experience that problem again. And you can see that in calling this man, they're going to experience the same problem. If you've just had a church blow up over paedo communion, and then you try to call another guy that takes exception with paedo communion, the presbytery might at liberty say, no, this is probably not good for the church. And so it doesn't need to be something that's necessarily striking at doctrinal issues, but it could be just fits and past issues that a church has experienced.
Yeah.
Well, think if there's a background check that then that person fails, that needs to be an option for the presbytery to say no at that point too.
Yeah. I don't know what hat I'm supposed to be wearing right now. I actually don't have a hat on, but this I think getting it in place just makes us more Presbyterian. It kind of dials it in a little bit more. Shows that the presbytery has a responsibility and a authority and a right to do some of these things. Yeah.
This is one schismatic, or not schismatic. What's the word I'm thinking of? I can't think. Never mind. I'm thinking too much in the schizophrenic. This is one schizophrenic episode. I couldn't get my mind out of the schismatic church idea. We're just all over the place.
Following in a similar vein, we'll look at Overture 27. Fairly straightforward, simple overture, and plays well with Overture 2. I think it will require Overture 2 I think the best way to forward is to amend Overture 2 to include the language from 27, which simply adds an additional specificity to the current examination for transfers in 13.6. It just adds including personal character and family management. This is things that we examine for in, all ordination, both in 21 and 24. So it makes sense to include some questions about that in our transfer exam. I think it's a great idea. I see no reason not to incorporate that specific language into the new version of 13.6 and given by Overture 2. I don't really see a whole lot controversial about this, but maybe I'm wrong.
Scott likes to be divisive. Okay. Well, Jared,
I think
you
the
take a swing
pushback would
at
just
it.
be, the pushback would just be, is this needed? I mean, it's already in 1 Timothy 3. Is there a problem that this is solving, or is this just kind of needless, busy work? Kind of the same with your argument against 28, right? Do we really need to change important and substantive, or is this just it doesn't really affect anything?
Yeah, that's fair. All right, moving on, Overture 30 from Low Country Presbytery, requiring an exit interview. 30 and 32 are similar, but they're different enough that I want to actually handle them separately, if that's all right with y'all.
We have no authority here, so.
Sorry, say it again.
We have no authority here, so whatever you want to do. Yeah.
All right, there we go. So 30 deals with exit interviews, requiring now an exit interview for men before their pastoral relationship is severed, dissolved from a church, is the context that was aimed at there. And just providing a process for that. The thought being, we do all of these examinations and all of this work as a man is coming into a call. And often when a man is leaving a call, there can be virtually nothing done, just a single line item, a rubber stamp here and there, and everything's, we just kind of move on, which sometimes is fine. but sometimes covers up some deeper issues, whether that's the church has not treated him well and given some version of severance with an NDA attached to it. Was actually the context from what as I understand it from Low Country was the context that first prompted the thought here. That the man then felt he wasn't able to talk to the presbytery about what had gone on in his call because he had this NDA and had to be able to provide for his family. I think that's not the only possible context for this, but I think that was one of the prompting issues that brought that up. I think it's a good idea as a way to reveal issues that may not have been super clear until things blew up, until it came time for either to him to resign or the church to say, no, we want to be relieved of you or whatever. I think it's a way for the presbytery to both care for the man and care for the church and exercise shepherding, stewarding care over all of the churches and teaching elders in the presbytery.
I think the pushback on this would be similar to an earlier one of it gives the presbytery something else to do, and sometimes presbyteries don't want more to do. And the other would be maybe this is a good idea for some. Is it required for all, though? And if it's the overture seems to require it for all, should this be an option, or should this be a mandate for every single person? And I think that might get some pushback there. Have this as an option, but not necessarily a requirement. Just trying to think of some pushback that there might be there.
Yeah, when you think through, in Ileana, we only bring in about one guy a year, and so it's really no big deal for us to do something like that. But we have presbyteries in the PCA that, I mean, our neighboring presbytery, Missouri, has 100 commissioners at their presbytery every meeting, and that could be cumbersome. I'm sure they have guys, especially because they're a seminary. They have a seminary in their bounds. They have guys coming in and out probably much more often than most, and so it could be even more cumbersome for them to process interviews in cases where there doesn't need to be one.
Well, and one of the things to keep in mind is this doesn't specify what that interview looks like. It doesn't have to be an interview, just as we have candidates credentials committees that do the majority of the work in examining men coming in. And I think that's the case in pretty much every presbytery. We could also have, a ministers and churches committee or something like that maybe conducts a 3-minute phone call with a guy. Hey, tell us what's going on. Why are you stepping down? Oh, I got a new job. I got a new call in such and such a city, and everything's great here, but it's time to move on. Okay, cool. That's your interview. And that would be sufficient to meet the requirement, and then just have a notation in the minutes. Yes, we did the interview. Check. Let's move on. So I don't know that it would require an onerous process, but it would at least, I think, leaving it as an option doesn't actually accomplish anything because these things are when they happen, often they go unseen because whether the man feels like he can't say anything for whatever reason, I think it's a better choice to make it a requirement.
I mean, it's getting at the thing that everybody. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
The people that aren't going to like this are people that I guess like NDAs. If your church is a big NDA church, every minister that leaves signs an NDA. They're probably going to hate this thing.
That sounds like an excellent reason to approve it. Let's go.
I can't remember the last time.
Just convinced me.
It came up on the floor of our presbytery where a guy, it said like, hey, we need to approve the transfer of this guy to this church. And it pauses for a second. And before we vote, somebody goes, can somebody tell us why he's leaving? What's going on? And it's usually something like you just said, well, he got a new call. Somebody reached out to him. He's leaving. Sometimes there's, other circumstances that need to be discussed, but it's always on our minds. Right. And I think, yeah. I'm here. Well,
and sometimes he got a new call can cover up the fact, well, why was he looking for a new call?
Yeah.
Was there something going on in the session in the church true. that led him to say, I need to find someplace else to be because this is not healthy? And sometimes that doesn't come out and you get 5 pastors in a row that get chewed up and spit out, and a church experiences quite a lot of turnover over the course of 10 or 15 or 20 years that maybe doesn't get noticed because it's not every presbytery meeting. And this at least has the hope of bringing some of that to the fore. All right. Moving on, Overture 32. That again deals with exit interviews and dissolution of calls. This one is more specifically aimed at those men who are serving as RUF ministers, as working for committees and agencies, and what is the interaction between the presbytery's authority over the man's call versus the agency's authority over his employment, and how do those play together. The ACs recommended that we punt this to next year because in their kind of rationale was we didn't get a chance to take a look at this. Okay. I don't know that we should necessarily agree with them on that, but that's another conversation. I believe, and I find my notes here, I think CCB said that this was a bad idea, but I don't remember why.
Well, it just said it was in conflict and that it required a presbytery to cite a committee or agency of a higher court.
Okay, so that's actually a big issue, but it's one that needs to be addressed because as our committees and agencies, particularly RUF and MTW, are getting larger and getting more intricate in their own organization, their internal organization, we're starting to move away from presbytery-led ministries and move toward assembly-level organizational ministries. And if we want to do that, that's fine, but that is a significant change from where we've been in the past. And I think that's what part of what's being addressed here. If RUF finds a guy unacceptable, that the presbytery is like, he's our guy. This is who we want to do the college ministry at this campus. Who wins? Who has the final vote there? And I think this allows some of that to be brought forward.
And some of this, there's a new RUF agreement, I believe, that will be approved at this assembly that is different than the other new one, the first new one. There's a new one. And I think some of 32 might be addressed in the new one.
Are you having a stroke?
No, I'm not having a stroke. There's an old new one and a new one.
I think that is a good point, though, is that 32 might run out of steam if everybody likes the RUF agreement and say it's not necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
The new one is good.
Starting to sound like a Doctor Who episode.
Oh,
New York.
It's clear that this particular matter needs to be dealt with in some way, and however that comes to pass, whether this or the affiliation agreement. It does make you wonder, is something like this needed? The affiliation agreement's going to deal with RUF, but are we going to run into this kind of thing in other places over time? To Alex's point that our permanent committees and agencies are just growing and growing. We may need something more like this in the long term. Hopefully not, but
yeah. And without something like this, it does a disservice to both parties when there are not clear boundaries concerning who makes what decision. You step on each other's feet and you get hurt and there are sore feelings. And so having clearly defined boundaries of how calls are executed, maintained, and dissolved is good for RUF as well as the presbytery, so that things don't happen in a way that hurt both parties, as well as that ministry on campus, if you're, of course, wanting to maintain the fruitfulness of that ministry.
Yeah, and RUF's argument is, as I understand it, and again, this is touching on the affiliation agreement, which is a whole other conversation, but their argument has been along the lines of we're going to get ourselves in real trouble with employment law with the way things have been set up. We need to restructure this so that it's clear that you work for RUF, not we've got 88 different employers in the different presbyteries. And so there is an argument there for we need to work this out differently legally. but I think we've got to find a way to balance the legal requirements with our polity and the way that we've intentionally set this polity up as a grassroots, move the power down to the session and the presbytery as much as possible.
Yeah. The new affiliation agreement, I think, addresses a lot of that, and does so in a satisfying way. I don't know if any of you guys had the opportunity to read it.
I've read
yet,
everything.
but
I've read everything.
yeah, it's good. It's good. All right, who's up? It's Nelson. You have two. We gave you the
Yes.
easiest ones.
And
You assigned
only
me
two
just
of them?
And they
Here,
were
I can
late,
fix
which is
that.
great. No,
It's okay. Here.
you wanted to get me
here.
in trouble though, because I think you no longer wanted to have any questions about
There
directory
you
of
go.
worship directed towards you. So,
Yeah,
um,
I said 6 overtures to your plate.
oh, great. um, Overture 3 was the first one that came up. Overture 29 also deals with the same chapter, which is BCO 53, which is right now does not have the force of law according to the temporary statement that's been there for 47 years. This would seek to grant authoritative status to the entirety of chapter 53 with some minor changes. It talks about preaching there, and in the original, it just talks about the minister preaching. It would actually add in 53:1, 53:3, and 53:4, or qualified men. That way you understand that there can be a sermon even if the minister isn't there. You have pulpit supply or ruling elder has stepped in for that, or licentiate or something like that. I think the logic of this is it's laid out in the overture. One thing I usually cite is, according to the BCO, the session is supposed to direct and order worship according to the directory of worship, which then there's a tension because much of the directory of worship is said not to have the force of law, but 12.5e does have the force of law, which is, I think, a tension that's there. Adding qualified man then clarifies that, in fact, this isn't just saying only the minister can do a sermon, but then qualified man added in 53:6 then standardizes the language and then clarifies, I think, what is a fairly consensus view in the PCA, that only men can preach the sermon on Sunday mornings. I think the logic of this is the sacraments are constitutional in there, and if you do word and sacrament, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do the whole rest of the directory, because if we're about word and sacrament on Sunday mornings, those are probably the most important things to have direction for that. Now, this is a little bit different than 29. 29 doesn't seek to make the entire thing constitutional, just add a paragraph and then make that constitutional. That would just do the limiting side of that, which would be to say that women cannot preach, nor can they lead men in certain other settings, I guess conferences, chapel services, things like that. It's as if saw Overture 3 and said that's too broad. You need to narrow it down more. And I think this actually represents 3 and 29 represents two different approaches to, if you're going to go through the directory of worship and make it constitutional, is your aim to clarify and have the consensus view, which I think Overture 3 really is the consensus view in the PCA, or is it to narrow it? And I think 29 is the one that people who don't want to touch the directory for worship are afraid that it'll start to narrow in certain places, and will not be seeking the consensus view. So Overture 3 has those things going for it, but I know there's arguments against touching the directory for worship. I've encountered that a time or two.
Well, the thing about 29 as well, to bolster the point you just made, is that it's not seeking consensus as much as because it wasn't even approved by their presbytery. It's coming from a session. So it automatically sort of starts off with, hand tied behind its back.
Yeah, there's a CCB points out too. It's not just talking about Sunday morning worship. It's also talking about jurisdictions outside of the bounds of the PCA. And you can see they didn't quite know what to do with that. The decision was 3-2-3 of wait, can the directory for worship do that or can it not? And so there's just confusion on that matter.
We'll say
You hate the PCA.
3.
That's the conclusion I got from this discussion.
Pushback?
That's my pushback. That's all I got.
I will say for Overture 3, the suggested amendment for 53.6 is a terrible idea. The rest of it is fine, but changing no person to no qualified man leaves actually open the ability to call someone who is not a qualified man. So if you are a qualified man, you have to meet this standard. It has to be under the consent of the church, the consent of the session, whatever. I think that one, 53.6, should remain as no person, because that is a more exclusive position. Whereas if we change it to no qualified man, and I understand the desire to make that, a standardized language, but because it's a negative statement, that actually opens it more rather than tightening it more.
How would that work? I don't quite follow the argument.
So if you say no qualified man should be invited to preach or exhort in any of the churches under the care without the consent of the session, then you're saying someone who isn't a qualified man could be invited without the consent of the session.
You're saying an unqualified man.
Only it applies to qualified men.
Yeah.
Now that's a tortured argument, and I would hope that it would never be made. But if we're going to make changes, let's make the better change, and just leave this one as no person, whether you're a qualified man or not. You cannot be invited without the consent of the session.
One for the folks that are really wanting to say something about women and this preaching issue, person actually covers that. Qualified man doesn't cover that. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So will you make that amendment on the OC?
I intend to, if somebody doesn't beat me to it.
Scott's fast.
You heard it here first.
Try to outrun him, all right.
Alex Ford is in favor of constitutionalizing the entire directory, and so
that's
email
exactly
him
at
alex.ford@babylonb.com, and he'll get back to you.
Not the B. Not the B.
I just want to be
also
clear. If anybody's not certain about this, I am not Adam Ford. I am Alex Ford. Adam Ford is the guy with the Babylon Bee once upon a time.
All right, Adam.
I will point out that this would also, an argument for this would put as legally binding that there are not to be extemporary harangues in sermons. And there's just too many of those going on.
So many people need to hear that.
Look, man, if you got a problem with the way I preach, just say something.
Yeah, I think this is, if you're against doing any of the directory for worship, you're going to be against this, but this is actually less controversial than if this was trying to talk about who should read scripture in worship. That'd be more controversial. Even offerings or prayer sections would be more controversial. So I think the question really is, are you okay with making part of the directory constitutional this way? And if you are, it's probably one of the less controversial chapters. There may be one that's less, but there's definitely some that are more.
I mean, I oppose it simply because I don't want to have to rewrite my BCO exams, but it's fine.
Ooh.
Which ones are binding?
That question keeps getting more complicated, right? Which parts of the directory for worship are constitutional? And even I can't remember anymore. Yeah. It's a good argument, Jared, what you said. I hadn't thought about it before, that we've got the sacraments constitutionalized in the directory. And so adding preaching to that, adding the word ministry to that is significant. It's thoughtful. Okay, you can't possibly be done. Is that all that Scott assigned to you?
Yeah, I just assigned him like 17 more. So
I'll have to look at
are you ready? Are you ready?
Is he doing them right now?
I didn't prepare for those.
All right.
Why don't you go first, Ben, and then I'll see if I can clean up.
Oh yeah, I'm eager to go first because my category is called potentially controversial, which is made me so excited to get ready for this. So what did he give? Did he get? No. Hold your.
He did it in the past 5 minutes.
Calm down. Let's here. We'll come back to yours at the end because they're more miscellaneous, aren't they? They're not really connected. Is that the other category that he had down there? Let's work through some controversial ones, and I'm not quite sure how legitimate that.
We should probably start the episode with these.
I don't know how some of these aren't super controversial. I don't think. Here, I wrote all of these. This is how Scott told me to do this. I wrote all of them. They came from my hand. I know it's weird that they came from presbyteries that I'm not a member of, but Scott made the rules. Overture 7 is from Ascension, and it rewrites RAO 11.5. So currently, RAO 11.5 gives instructions to the stated clerk on what to do with overtures when he receives them. So some of them go, if they're about boundaries, they go to M&A. If they're about the BCO and the RAO, they go to CCB for advice. And anyway, they go different places to be dealt with. And this just rewrites the whole section in order to make it clear what exactly is supposed to happen. And now, when I was writing this and considering last year's General Assembly and trying to figure out what exactly should happen with things, some of y'all may be aware that there was some discussion about a particular overture last year of who was supposed to make the recommendation. Was it overtures, or was it going to be the administrative committee, and who was giving advice to which committee, and who was going to present first on the floor of the General Assembly? And this really just tries to bring clarity to the whole matter of who's advising in certain circumstances, who's making recommendations in those circumstances. And it just helps things flow a whole lot better. It explains where the amendments are to be sent. And anyway, I mean, I could keep going, but you guys, object to it. That's right. And
this is potentially controversial, I guess, given the context of last year's Overture 7, that kind of pre-assembly had some little fireworks go off where every COC was considering Overture 7 all at once, except the OC, but then the OC itself decided they were going to take jurisdiction over it. And so it was all over the place. And so this amendment is seeking to help stop that from happening again. But given the nature of it being originating from controversy, the AC's office or the AC committee supports it, so it's probably less controversial now.
They've said that they support it now? Yeah. Oh, okay. I think originally they didn't have a recommendation.
This comes from our presbytery, and the one who wrote it consulted with the clerk's office and tried to get it to a place where they could be supportive of it. Now all of the RAO would go to the OC, but they would have advice coming in from other committees on those changes to the RAO. I think a few objections to this could be if it overcomplicates it. It adds a lot more to it, and so if the more words, the more potential you have for objection. Also, RAO 15.1 came up last year, and that's not touched on in this. And so either we're specifying what's sent to the OC. Now, that's not an exhaustive list in 15.1, but it may be something that people want to look at. And so that could be an objection to say, hey, you're not dealing with 15.1, and that could be in a bit of unclarity.
I'm offended at your objections, especially the one that says it's too complicated. Did you read RAO 11.5 already? I mean, it's already complicated, so we're not making it worse, right? So, well, that might be the most controversial overture that I've ever talked through with guys. Let's see. Now we're gonna look at 13. Scroll. 13 is out of Calvary Presbytery, and immediately some people clench up just hearing that. But this just simply requests that the letter written by that moderator appointed commission, was it a committee or commission? It was been a commission, right?
Commission.
Last year, addressing the matter of minors and transgender surgeries that was distributed to the federal government by the denomination. Calvary is simply encouraging sessions and presbyteries to send, I guess, the substance of that letter or the same letter to their own governments and municipalities.
So the major objection here is that it's out of order. It's asking us to do what was already included in that existing commission, and a commission is an action of the body that commissioned it. We've already done this. And historically, at least, when we get an overture requesting that we do something that we've already done, it gets ruled out of order post haste. So I don't see how this doesn't get ruled out of order pretty quickly.
Just flipping to my other hat, all of the PCA churches in Arkansas, we have a church plant that we oversee in Jonesboro. All of the churches in Arkansas have already done this. They banded together and sent the same letter. They all signed the same letter to the governor's office and other government offices there.
The churches in Utah, we talked about it, and then we realized that the state government has already worked on this and already passed laws based on it. So they would kind of be telling them, hey, you could do this thing that you've already done. So as I say,
the presbyteries were already, or the state governments were already encouraged to be petitioned. And so It seems redundant. There are also two words for you: petition fatigue. Um, we had only petitioned before that I can find in the 70s for abortion, the 80s for abortion, and then 2 years ago for abortion. This was a new area of an idea for being an extraordinary case to petition, and so only having three times in 50 years done it, and then doing it having petitions on our docket three times in 3 consecutive years. I think there's going to be some petition fatigue of saying we may be getting off from the mission of the church here.
It kind of gets back to like when we've had study committee fatigue for a while, and I'm wondering that might still actually be in effect. I don't know if there's any desire to do more study committees at the moment, and it's because we just did so many in the 2010s that it exhausts everyone, and I think that might be true also with these.
On to Overture 14. By the way, if anybody watches The Office, the way Scott has instructed us to do this, I feel a lot like Dwight after Michael's golden ticket idea, and it went so poorly, and then he handed it to Dwight, and Dwight was trying to pretend like he loved Willy Wonka, but he didn't know how. Anyway,
are you saying I'm terrible? Is that what you just said?
No. I'm just saying, like,
I had a terrible idea.
Dwight didn't ever watch Willy Wonka, and I didn't really write Overture 14. But when I was considering how to write Overture 14, what came to mind, and I know the author of this particular overture. I believe it arose out of last year's Committee of Commissioners. There was some information that seemed to not be provided to the Committee of Commissioners that was asked for in the midst of their meeting. And so this amendment arose up out of that. It amends RAO 421 and just simply adds some data requirements for higher institutions, which is really just Covenant College and Covenant Theological Seminary. Add some data for them to include in their minutes. So total student enrollment, number of students, full-time or part-time, number of students by gender, and then number of students by learning modality, whether they're in person in the classroom, whether they're online or some kind of hybrid of those two. And so it's really just, I think the argument could be made that more information is always helpful in these regards. It is good for us to know what's going on at our college and our seminary. If it's going well and the numbers reflect that, that's good for us to know and praise the Lord for. If it's not going well, it gives us, prayer requests and things to know that we can, offer our help or whatever it may be. If CTS needs more men in the MDiv program, that's a good thing for me to know as I pray for young men in my church to be called to ministry. I know that CTS, has room for them or whatever the case may be. So there it is.
Yeah, this perhaps could have been more controversial than it is. Both Covenant College and CTS are recommending this overture. I could have seen it going the other way. I actually anticipated it to go the other way because I've only gotten percentage numbers from CTS. They've had they've had growing, admission rates by 138%, and it's just not helpful to know that 138% of what, if it's 138% of 1,000 and you doubled the size of the seminary to 2,000 something, that's great news. Let's celebrate. But if it's like 8 to 15, that's, a little different story. And so
again, I was told there'd be no math.
There'd be no math. Here's all your math. So I don't think it's controversial anymore. I think that it will just be passed probably with a little discussion given the recommendation from the permanent committees.
Some people may suggest that this is asking for information that just means more work, but the truth of it is that for accredited institutions, they have this information readily available. They have to. And so it's just a matter of copy and paste for the most part.
Biggest objection I had to it until I saw that both organizations were in favor of it was that this information is already available. It's in public. They've got to report it elsewhere. Why are we adding this additional requirement to this particular place? But, that's not a massive problem with it. It's just,
I appreciated Scott giving me three that were just in a row. Nice and easy to scroll. 13, 14. Overture 15. Another one coming from a session in James River Presbytery, the session of West End Presbyterian Church. It seeks to amend BCO 7.2 to restrict the offices of elder and deacon to biological men only. It's adding the word biological to the very end of the paragraph in BCO 7.2. And let's see, not to be for this. In our day and age, this makes sense, right? Why not be as clear as we possibly can? That's the best I got.
The problem is that it acknowledges that there is a category of non-biological men, and that's problematic in major ways. Whatever you think about the transgender movement, this is not the way to deal with it in the church.
Yeah, biological male is kind of redundant.
And if you don't think it's redundant, there's a problem. Redundant. Yeah.
It's if it were just redundant, okay, fine. Yeah, I don't like it, but I'll deal. But it actually opens us to a category that we don't admit exists. And this would be putting in our Constitution an admission that category is a real thing and we're denying it. It's just bad. The law of unintended consequences is going to kill this.
Then you've got to go start adding this word everywhere else, biological qualified men, or even, hey, at the end of that one we were just talking about, biological person, right? Like,
right.
Anyway,
it opens the door in terrible ways.
Wait, do we need to have some sort of amendment so that AI can't preach?
Oh man. I guarantee you, and I don't want to say it, I guarantee you that in the PCA somewhere somebody has preached a sermon that AI wrote. That it may have been an intern or some stupid person that doesn't know any better, but I bet it's happened.
Let's not talk about that. That's not the point of this episode. I think people might have fatigue already with all the sexuality stuff, more sexuality stuff, the death by 1,000 cuts. I think this issue has been sufficiently addressed in our Constitution, and we can probably move on.
All right, so we're going to look at Overture 31. I think I'll probably just say it outright. This and the next one we're going to look at are probably the more controversial in the list that Scott gave me. And so,
I actually didn't make this list, by the way. This was inherited by...
Yeah, but you put my name at the top of this section, so
I did.
You're the man. Overture 31 is from New River Presbytery, which I'll be honest, I didn't know we had a presbytery called New River until I got to this. Wants to amend what?
I was a member of that presbytery for a while.
Where is it?
West Virginia.
West Virginia. Okay, well.
How dare you?
Exclusive of the Eastern Panhandle, but yeah.
I don't understand anything you just said. It's exclusive of part of Florida. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. This wants to amend BCO 14.17 and change some things related to permanent committees and agencies and their policies. So you guys know this has come up, in 2021 and moving forward, we've had matters of policy change come up regarding MTW and RUF. There was, debates last year about the affiliation agreement, and then MTW in 2021, there were some substantial changes, or a substantial change made to their policy manual that they had to adapt to. And so the addition here to RAO, is it all right? Did I get it wrong?
14.1, and then also an additional adding 14.1.8 and renumbering everything that currently 8 and following.
Oh, here, sorry, I was misreading my own notes. So changing BCO 14. So here's part of the argument. We added RAO 4 at one point, showing that GA interprets 14 as the permanent committee and agencies being allowed to create and make changes, but only requiring them to report material changes in their thing. So RAO 4 says a recording of information sufficient to demonstrate the committee or board's implementation of instructions received from the General Assembly and of material policies and material policy changes. And so the argument would be here that the agencies it's implied already in our book that these committees and agencies can create and make policy changes, and this seeks merely to bring it in alignment, I suppose is the way we'd say it. That gives them authority to operate a little bit more independently as they see fit. Y'all may have more things to add. Yeah, come on.
Overture. I think the big objection is that nobody's going to understand it.
Did I make it that clear that I don't understand it?
No, that was not pointing at you necessarily. I was pointing at myself. I'll be honest. I called one of the authors of the Overture this morning. He's a friend of mine, and was like, "Okay, explain this to me because I'm really struggling to figure out what it is you're trying to do and what what the goal is here." Because some people are arguing that it is that the committees and agencies are going to love it because it gives them more power, and other people are arguing that the committees and agencies are going to hate it because it takes their power away. What's going on with this? And the answer is it wasn't trying to do either. It was trying to thread the needle between them just to clarify some of the confusion about when and where and which policies can be changed and what needs to be submitted and like that. I think the fact of that unclarity, and I will freely admit that the author and the guys that worked on it consulted with Brian Chappell and Fred Greco and a couple of guys at RUF, Will Huss and some others. So there's been quite a lot of consultation with the committees and agencies, with the denominational guys who are, the polity nerds at the highest level. I mean, other than you guys, obviously.
We're the lowest level.
They're the lowest level.
Fair. I was going to say I'm the lowest level, but that's fine. I think the unclarity is going to sink this. I think AC's recommendation was to punt to next year to give them more time to look at it and figure out what they want to do with it or what they want to recommend. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that recommendation will carry the day, because people are going to look at it and go, what are we doing? What is this asking us to do, and what's the goal? And it's just hard to nail that down. I think, talking to my friend, I think is a good goal of bringing clarity in a difficult place to bring clarity. But I think we need to have some more time working through it with the committees and agencies to figure out exactly what the best thing is and whether this is a needed change or not, and all of those things.
Yeah, I read it as giving more power to the committees. And so I already have a concern that our committees sometimes functions as if they're commissions anyway. And so, yeah, it would need to be clarified a whole lot more that that's not what it's doing before. I think it would get wide support.
As I understand it, Fred's initial response was the committees are going to hate this because it restricts their authority. And I had the same reaction that you did, Jared, where I was like, oh, the committees are going to love this. This is going to be great for them. Wait, hang on. Which one of those is it? So,
yeah. All right, Ben, your favorite overture here, the one that you actually wrote.
I wrote Overture 33. I wrote it very quickly. It just came onto my desk all of a sudden a couple days ago. Just showed up. Overture 33 is actually from an individual teaching elder, Ben Inman, out of Eastern Carolina Presbytery. Similar to the way Sessions sometimes have theirs rejected, but they bring him anyway. Inman similarly brought his to the Presbytery and they rejected it, and he's bringing it on his own. Some of you may remember, have heard of a book called Jesus Calling, written by a lady named Sarah Young, who is a missionary. She was married to a missionary in the PCA. She wrote this book called Jesus Calling. I don't know how much into the weeds we want to get. There's plenty of resources out there on the internet that get into all these details. But there's some concerning things going on in a book like this. There's some Second Commandment issues at play, some Third Commandment issues at play, potentially, that the book claims to sort of take on the voice of Christ and speak to the reader, as it were. And so Mr. Inman is simply trying to get an ad interim committee put together to, well, there's three main points to state the historical relationship of the PCA and this book, to demonstrate whether it constitutes a violation of the Second Commandment according to our standards, and then bring any recommendations back in terms of repentance related to the publication of this book. He does have some recommendations for who would make up such a committee, and it's connected to the Theological Examining Committee, and he limits the budget of it, imagining, I think, that they would use video conferencing for most of it and not need hotel rooms or airfare.
Contextually, why Ben submitted this himself is I don't think he serves in a local session, and so there is no session to send up the overture that he submitted to the presbytery, and so he
That's a good
himself
point.
submitted the
Thank you.
overture from his own hand, and so I think it's kind of helpful to think through the polity of how an individual sends, and so since he doesn't have a session, he sends it up himself.
So it wasn't that he was
So if
acting
our job
independently
is,
from his session. He was just acting the way he
Yeah.
could. Yeah. Good.
so if our job is to push back, I think first, overtures rejected by presbytery have a hard time. Second, study committee fatigue. I think third would be many may have problems with the book, especially the original introduction had some bad stuff in it, poor wording choice at least. But there may be a better avenue for going about if a layperson in the PCA writes something that is problematic, probably local sessions or presbyteries are the place where that should go to. I mean, there's probably a lot of PCA laity who have written books that are problematic, maybe that haven't sold this many, but if we start doing it, the question is, are we opening up something to, we have to have study committees and responses to major best-selling books from PCA lay people. And the question is, do we want to go down that road? So I think those are the major objections to this.
I'm sure the other guys want to say, but the two thoughts on that, at least, the volume of sales on this book is incredibly large. I think that stands out as a point that a lot of it has circulated the world. Also, if I'm not mistaken, Sarah Young was featured in the 50th magazine, I think, and I think that is one thing that stood out to a lot of people so far is that her name at least was given some publicity in the PCA, and because she's sold so many copies, it's hard to disconnect from the book itself. Anyway,
I think the rest of that argument is that yes, there are other pathways for correcting lay members' mistakes in books, whatever. But this book's been out for a while, and none of those have happened.
yeah, that's good.
And when you're dealing with such clear violations, arguably additions, that's not something we can let slide. So we need to handle it, but it hasn't been handled. So how do we get it before a court of the church somewhere so that we can discuss this? I think would be Ben's argument. I haven't spoken to him, so I don't know, but I suspect that would be part of a lot of the weight of it.
Is there any mechanism for sending this down somehow? You know, like to the presbytery? I don't know. I mean, off the top of my head,
I think the option that we have is refer back.
Yeah.
Just be referring it back to him individually, which is effectively going to kill it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's
and
my list.
I don't think an individual presbytery could really address the concerns that he's got here of the widespread nature of its use and adoption. It really is an issue that is probably, if we're going to address it at all, it probably needs to be handled at the highest possible level because it covers such a breadth of the PCA.
And to be fair, the
question is,
come on. The question is,
I was going to say, the question is it something that needs to be addressed at this point, given what else is true? And I think you were about to touch on that as well.
Well, I was just going to say, she's not alive anymore. And so there's no way for her to be disciplined or to be brought before her session in any way at all. And so how else are we supposed to deal with this broad scope of an issue? You know, it's interesting to see how to play this. This will play out.
Well, there are three more overtures that I think got put in my lap here.
Four more.
31 listed on the document twice.
Yeah, we did 31 already.
So overture 9 is to add a requirement in BCO 12 5E on the responsibilities of the session. That is to make sure that the church and congregation is living in obedience to the Great Commission. So that would be added to what it is that the session has a responsibility to do. I don't really know what the impetus is behind this or what need this is fulfilling. So I don't really have a good defense of it.
Is it because in your old age you're having trouble remembering when you originally wrote it, what your
Yeah.
reasoning and things?
I
Is that
mean,
what this is, or?
I think if I had to reconsider, I may not. I mean, the Great Commission also includes some things that the congregation shouldn't be doing, like baptizing people. So I wonder if this is a good intention, but maybe haven't thought through the implications of it.
Even if we decide that this is a thing that the session needs to be in charge of, that the congregation needs to be doing, and obviously we need to be engaged in evangelism, the proposed edition is at best awkward where it's currently located. It does not fit well with 12.5e. It just doesn't. And even if we were to, move it somewhere else, I think it's adequately covered by 12.5a, which requires that the session inquire into the Christian conduct and to censure those found delinquent. Right understanding of Christian conduct includes engagement in the Great Commission, engagement in preaching the gospel and sharing the faith. And so I think if we've already covered in 12.5a, why do we need to add an additional explicit clause somewhere else where it doesn't really fit?
It's kind of like a solution looking for a problem,
Yeah.
right? The Constitution can be judged as sufficient in this area.
In contrast to that is Overture 10, which is, I think, maybe a good clarification. This is why I wrote this one. 13.9 G, that it would add, in fact, what the presbytery is looking over is the spiritual welfare of churches and each teaching elder, since that's the makeup of the membership of the presbytery. So that would just add that clarifying element to BCO 13.9.
I am not a fan of this. I think that, and that's not even my hat. I actually, anyway.
Which hat are you wearing?
Exactly. No, I think I think it is valuable and good to reiterate that it's the responsibility of presbyteries to care for teaching elders within their bounds. I think that's good. It should be enunciated clearly. This is not where to put that, and it's not a clear statement of what the responsibility is or a plan for how to carry it out. This doesn't really add much of anything other than, I don't even know. This feels like a solution looking for a problem. I would like to know what Metro Atlanta was looking at that was saying, oh, this isn't happening, and so we need to add this and figure it out. I don't see where this is a valuable thing. My suggestion would be refer this back and let them clear some of that and nail down the best possible place to put it in some better language for it to be put in. And yeah,
I don't see how either of the last two overtures would change much, if anything, in the denomination.
You think that things happen at General Assembly change things in the denomination? It's interesting. That's an interesting take. You heard it here, folks. All right.
Well, then looking at 22, Overture 22 would clean up a discrepancy from BCO 8.7 and 13.2. 8.7 requires the TE's membership to be held in the presbytery within whose bounds he labors. But then BCO 13.2 says that his membership is held within the geographical bounds he resides. So this would clarify that and change 13.2 to be where the minister labors, so that those wouldn't be in conflict. And this can affect somebody if they are living. I live right along a border of a presbytery. Somebody's living actually in one presbytery, and then he's serving a church or serving some sort of agency or college that's in a different one. Where should he be a member of? And the BCO actually contradicts itself of where he should be a member. And so this clarifies it's where he's laboring, because the presbytery should have authority over the things in its boundaries.
I have no objection to this. I think this is a worthwhile, good change.
Yeah, it's simple,
not earth-shattering, but valuable.
Not much changes. I would maybe want it to go further, but maybe that's another amendment for a different year on the relationship for how a man serves out of bounds when they do labor out of bounds geographically. But that might be doing too much for this overture, because sometimes presbyteries okay a call that's not within their jurisdiction, and they don't tell the presbytery that's actually in the jurisdiction that they have a guy going there. And so that there needs to be some cleanup work in our Constitution on that, but this is good as it is. Wish it went further, but well, that might be another year kind of thing.
Did we do it?
All right.
Was that it? Scott,
Done the
anything
work
else?
of Overtures Committee in 2 hours. This is great.
Man.
All right, let's
All
just
right.
forward this to the convener. Who's that this year?
I don't think
remember.
that's been announced yet.
Yeah, I don't think so. Well, here, let me bring us home. As the Overtures Committee will probably vote and would certainly say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. If you're interested in learning anything about what we've talked about, check out the show notes. So I guess in this particular case, we'll have links to the GA website where you can see the overtures. I'm going to try to do a good job with chapter markers in this this episode, which is useless information for you if you just listen to the whole thing. But if you need to go back and find where we talked about a particular overture, there'll be chapter markers, hopefully, for most of the ones that we talked about in particular. Many thanks to Alex Ford for coming on with us today. Not Adam Ford, Alex Ford, not the B. Brother, thank you for being with us. Listeners, if you enjoyed the show, do consider following us on Twitter and Facebook at Polity Matters. Make sure you subscribe in your podcast app of choice. Every Tuesday, we're sending stuff out, and sometimes in between. If you've got any questions or comments, you can contact us on social media. You can email us at polymattersfeedback@gmail.com. You can shout at us from across the room at General Assembly in just a few weeks when we see you in person. Be sure to remember that we will have swag with us at GA, so find one of the three of us and, I don't know, say something that would make us give you whatever we've got. Thanks again for spending your time with us. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, gentlemen.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Y'all take care.